Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Stephanie, was justice served in the trial of Derek Chauvin?
That's a really complicated question because I think a lot of people want to believe that justice was served. And when we think about the criminal legal system, I guess it worked the way that it was supposed to, right? And Derek Chauvin was charged. The prosecution proved the charges beyond a reasonable doubt, and we know that soon he will be sentenced. But justice being served would be that George Floyd would still be alive, right? It shouldn't have gotten to this point. Yes, we understand that he was being arrested. There may have been a little bit of a struggle, if we want to call it that. But we all know that there are plenty of instances where people have walked away fine when they are engaged with law enforcement officers, correct? So was justice served? In my opinion, no, I don't think so. But there was some accountability on behalf of the Floyd family. Well, not on behalf of the Floyd family, but you know what I mean.
Well, it's a big question, and it's a lot to unpack. So I appreciate us just launching into it. And it's your experience, the totality of your experience we're looking at, talking to you about today, and how you look as a lawyer in this through your lens at this particular case. And a lawyer is just one of, I should mention, just one of the many titles, maybe, Stephanie, that you have in your life. And by the way, in no particular order, because husbands do get a little sensitive about this, but you are a lawyer.
Yes.
You are a lawyer, you're a wife, you're a mom of three, something we have in common, and we've talked about a little bit,
yes.
the challenges and joys of motherhood of three.
Yes.
You're also a policy strategist for the ACLU Louisiana, so the American Civil Liberties Union. You're not speaking in an official capacity for them. I want to make that clear.
Correct.
But you've been a lawyer for many, many years, done a bunch of different things in law, from working as a prosecutor, working in entertainment law as well, Stephanie.
Yes.
Civil law. Did you always know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
No, actually, that's a great question. No. So I went to the University of Miami undergrad, and I was actually a music major. And I started off as a jazz vocal major and then went into music business. And so
wait, are you going to sing will you sing?
I have a little bit of a cold, so I don't know if I can sing.
We'll save that for our next interview, but that's okay. So I'm sorry. So music and business.
Correct. And so I thought that's, it combined, because I'm a huge music fan. I love music, all types of music. And so I thought maybe, I did an internship actually at Arista Records back home in New York. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. I can do entertainment law, right? And so I thought, yes, after I finish undergrad, I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to be a huge famous entertainment lawyer and make all these big bucks, and I'm going to be living the life, right?
That sounds great. I'm totally in it. I'm in it. Right.
Me too. I love it. But then, you make plans and then God laughs, right? And so I realized that entertainment law, as great as it is, and I've met some wonderful people, it's not really what I was passionate about. I was great doing it, but it's more so a lot of paperwork than anything. And I'm the type of person, I can't just sit behind a desk all day. I want to be out. I want to be meeting people, want to have conversations, and I want to effectuate change. And, as an entertainment lawyer, I was helping my clients and I loved it, but I wanted my impact in the world to be a little bit more than that. Yeah.
And so then you launched into a series of different decisions that led you around the United States, by the way, now in Louisiana, and now working as a policy strategist for the ACLU. What exactly does that mean?
A policy strategist? What I do is what we like to call working the ledge. So I go to the legislature and I try to propose different policies, different laws, to change different laws. My focus, though, is primarily on the criminal legal system. And
fascinating.
So, yeah, it is. It's really, really, really cool. You get to meet some really phenomenal people. And what I really love about the job is that I get to work with people on both sides of the aisle. It's not simply conservatives and liberals. I'm working with everybody needs to come together in order for a bill to pass. And so I don't want to call it compromises. Maybe negotiations need to be made a little bit, but everyone is working together to get to an ultimate goal. And that's what I love. One of the things I love so much about this job.
That's really great to even understand the perspective on that, because we talk about laws all the time, but how exactly they come together and how exactly they're passed, what that process is like and how long it takes is sometimes not always covered, in part because sometimes it's difficult to understand. And that's something I do want to talk to you about today. We're going to talk about a lot of different angles to this particular story. We're going to focus on the trial of Derek Chauvin, but we're also going to talk about some of these broader questions about police reform, about race in America. And we asked a question at the beginning of this week. We're speaking on the week of the verdict results of the Derek Chauvin trial about what does victory really look like in multiple aspects of this story. So I'm excited to have this conversation with you with such an amazing background to apply. One thing I want to mention, a little public service announcement, because we get this question a lot when we do interviews. We're a nonpartisan news platform. That's what I believe in, is providing quick, concise, nonpartisan information for people of all backgrounds. We often get the question when we're talking to any guest, and we just had a guest on foreign policy, Stephanie. So it doesn't apply necessarily to this topic about, well, if you have one guest with one perspective, why don't you instantly have another guest with another perspective, and then they can debate, which I understand where that question comes from, because so much of the news is actually debate. But that's not why I created SmartHER News. I really want to create value. And I think about the job of a journalist as a quilt maker. You know, you're pulling different threads of the story, different fabrics, and you're pulling it together in a way that hopefully will add comfort to your audience, because feeling current is a way to make someone feel comfort in a very chaotic world. And so we're going to speak to you today. We're pulling in a part of the threads of your story, the fabric of what you feel about it. In the next several days, we're going to do that from a different perspective, and it's all part of the process. So I feel really grateful that you're here and that we have this opportunity. So thank you for the time.
Thank you. Thank you for SmartHER News. I think that it's great, and it's not often that we have the option to get news from a nonpartisan source. So I think what you're doing is amazing. And thank you so much for having me on today.
Well, I really appreciate it. I called you just a few moments after the verdict. We were connected through a friend whose legal opinion, expertise I really trust. And she said, you should talk to Stephanie about this. And when we spoke, you said, you hear that there's a verdict, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure what would happen. Talk to us about that moment. You heard there was a verdict just very quickly after the jury went into deliberation. What did you think? What were you thinking at that moment?
So I was hopeful, but as an attorney, and as most attorneys know, whether you're dealing with criminal or civil law, when you're dealing with a jury, you have a jury, you just never know. You're always hopeful that it will swing your way, but you just never know. People are people, and everybody has their own opinions. You don't know if the jury's decision will swing your way. You don't know if they won't be able to reach a decision at all, wherein the judge will have to declare a mistrial, right? And then you'll have to do the whole entire process all over again. And so you're right. When we were speaking, I believe on Tuesday, I was just thinking, I don't know if they're gonna find him accountable. I don't know if they're gonna find him guilty. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine about it before the verdict was read, and we were discussing how they came to a decision within a short period of time, the jury, and usually that's a good thing, especially from the prosecutor's perspective, because it could mean, I did my job. They saw that I proved everything beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Again, like you just never know when you're dealing with a jury. And so when the verdict came back and it was found that he was guilty on all three counts, I think my mouth just dropped. I know. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you have something?
No, I was just, all three counts is a question that we've gotten a lot about. And it's an important reminder that the definitions of murder in every state looks a little bit different.
Right.
And so one of the questions that we've really received is, well, how can he be guilty on all three charges? If you did something that led to someone's murder, then how can you also be guilty of these other things that also led to someone's murder? Can you talk us through how that's possible?
Sure. So the prosecutors, which I thought was a very strategic move in this case, they charged him with 3 crimes. So the first one was second-degree unintentional murder. The second was third-degree murder. And the third was second-degree manslaughter, which all carry different charges. All of them, so for example, with second-degree unintentional murder, the prosecution had to show that Derek Chauvin killed Derek Floyd while committing a felony, right? So in this case, it was third-degree assault. For third-degree murder, they had to show that Derek Chauvin caused the death of George Floyd through imminent, dangerous activity, okay? The third one, second-degree manslaughter, they had to show that he exhibited culpable negligence, which showed that he created an unreasonable risk. And we have to understand that officers, in order to uphold the law, sometimes they have to use a degree of force, right? We all know that. What we have to look at is whether or not if another officer was in his position, would that same officer have exhibited the same force that he did? So we're looking at whether or not Derek Chauvin's force at the time of the event was unreasonable. And so it's different things that the prosecution had to prove in all those different charges. And so that's why they were able to bring those charges. And that's why the jury was able to find him guilty of all 3 charges, because they were proving different things.
What do you think was the strongest or the most strategic argument that the prosecution made?
The fact that they showed that number, the 9-minute number, I believe it was like 9:29. And that number just stuck in my head because you stayed on his neck for that long. And another thing that I thought that was very, very key that they showed was that even when first responders came, Derek Chauvin still didn't get up. And that to me showed negligence on his part, and it showed unreasonable force, in my opinion. And I thought that the jury was able to clearly see that. A lot of people had questions as to whether or not showing the video over and over and over and over again would have kind of desensitized the jury. But I think it really gave them the opportunity to fully digest how long Derek Chauvin was actually on George Floyd's neck, and to really see that there came a point where it was just unreasonable, and it was just negligent on his part to just remain there. Mm-hmm.
Now, you've also worked from the defense side as well, and you've talked about having you're defense minded as a lawyer. Yeah. What do you think was the strongest argument made by the defense, or what do you think was the missed opportunity that they had that they weren't able to execute in this case?
That's a really good question. Because so my husband's also an attorney. And so we were talking about that, like ever since, even before the trial started, we were trying to think about, okay, what kind of defense strategy are we going to have? Because we know that everyone has seen this video, and the video is what it is. You see it. There's no there's no way around it. There's absolutely no way around it. I think they really had a missed opportunity with their ultimate theory, their theory of the case, that it was the crowd that actually distracted him, or it was the individuals who were speaking to Derek Chauvin at the time, telling him to get off George Floyd's neck. That was a distraction, and that's why he remained on George Floyd's neck. I think that it was a little bit insulting. I thought it was insulting to the jury. I think that I probably would have, as his attorney, I think that, you never want to admit to it, but I think that I would have come from the perspective that I was doing what I was trained to do, which is what they said. But I would have just stuck to that. I wouldn't have tried to place blame on something else. I would have stuck with the fact that I did, as a law enforcement officer, what I was trained to do. And this is why I did it. But again, that would have probably necessitated him to testify. And that probably wouldn't have been a good look either.
Oh, you don't think so? You don't think it would have been good for the jury to hear from him? The argument behind that, of course, is that you get to tell some of your own story. You get to humanize yourself as a person as well. You can spend a lot of time talking about that as long as it's allowed. And maybe that connects with one juror, and that might be all that you need. But you think that risk was too high for them to take?
I do. I think that it was very, very risky because, like, as a prosecutor, if a defendant is taking the stand, you're like licking your chops. You're like, "Oh, I got you. I'm going to get you today."
Is that really the way the conversation goes? Because now I'm getting nervous.
No. Well, you're just thinking to yourself. You're like, because it doesn't happen very often, right? Usually, a defendant will decide I'm not taking the stand. I'm going to protect my rights. I'm going to protect myself, and I'm not going to take the stand, because you never know the direction that, the testimony can go in, right? You don't know, you run the risk of the defendant opening the door to something else, like to saying something, and then the prosecutor then being able to bring in like some other type of evidence. Like, let's say Derek Chauvin had another case, which is true. He had another case in which he had a complaint for, I guess, misconduct or unreasonable force, where he knelt on another girl's neck for a long period of time as well. So that gives me the opportunity to say, well, this is not the first time that you did this, right? You've done this before, but luckily the person didn't die that time, right? So there's just a lot that can go wrong.
That's high stakes. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot more sense, for sure. I mean, it all, and either way, this is the way the outcome came down. We have 3 guilty charges. It is very rare, as you mentioned. Well, in a lot of cases, it's rare to see the defendant take the stand. It is very rare to see an officer charged with someone's death if that person is in custody. We're going to talk about why that is a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But I want to talk to you now about what happens next, because there's some language that the judge used that I wasn't as familiar with. Right. As he was mapping out the sentencing, he said, eventually we got to the sentencing is going to come in about 2 months, so 8 weeks. But he mentioned something called PSI. Right. That there was PSI was going to happen over the next several weeks, and he set different timelines for that. What is PSI? Why is it important?
Sure. So PSI is a pre-sentence investigation. What it does is it's a report created by a court service or a parole officer that looks into the criminal background or the criminal history of the defendant. It also takes into consideration the person's employment, the person's education, and the report is compiled and provided to the judge before the sentencing hearing. And so the judge will use that information when issuing his decision on the defendant's sentence. Because
it is his decision. It is the judge's decision. Does anyone help him with that? Does he have any aides that he'll talk to about it? Or is it really about him looking through what either side is presenting and coming to a personal conclusion?
Well, yes, it's totally remains with the judge. It's at the judge's discretion. As I said, well, I don't know if we talked about that, but for second degree and unintentional murder, Derek Chauvin can get up to 40 years. He can be sentenced up to 40 years. And so the judge has that discretion as to whether or not he's going to give him the full 40, or maybe he'll give him 10. It just all depends. What will happen is, of course, the judge probably has a law clerk. The law clerk may give him some case law showing what other rulings or what other sentences, other judges in the same jurisdiction have applied in a second degree unintentional murder case. So usually the judges tend to stick to, I guess, a range, unless it's like something that's like totally egregious, right? And during the sentencing hearing, the prosecution will present evidence. There'll be victim impact statements, and the defense will also provide their evidence and provide what's called mitigating factors. That's, they'll say, well, he was an officer for such and such years. He's educated, I hate to say it like this, but he's never killed anybody before,
If we don't
Go ahead, I'm
speak
sorry.
plainly, if we don't speak plainly, we're not going to know. And that's
Right.
to your point. It's the past record. It's anything relevant. Is it? Can anyone give an impact statement? Is your taxes part of the conversation? Is a speeding ticket part of the conversation? Can anything be used, or is it narrow in some respects?
It's narrow, and I would think because it's more so what's relevant. And so a traffic ticket really wouldn't be something that's very relevant. Taxes, unless maybe he was charged and convicted with like tax fraud or something like that, maybe that would come into consideration. But that's more so of a crime that's dealing with like lying. This wasn't the case, so we're not really looking into his I guess I wouldn't call it his character, but we're not looking at his propensity to lie in this case, because that's not what the charge was dealing with. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So when these briefs are prepared, the judge is going to take that into consideration. The judge is responsible, even though that there's 3 charges. He's sentenced on the most egregious charge. Is that the way that it normally works? That is it added up together?
So he'll provide a sentence for each charge, but then he'll have the option, or the judge can decide whether or not it's going to be, he can serve these, he will serve his term consecutively or concurrently. And so if it's concurrently, that means if he's sentenced to like 40 years for the second degree unintentional, 10 years for the third degree murder, and let's say 5 years for the second degree manslaughter, all of those he'll serve all of those at the same time. If it's consecutively, he's going to have to serve the sentence for the second degree first, then he'll have to send the 10 years afterwards, and then like the 5 years afterwards. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so what does it mean then when you hear these are the potential years that someone could serve, but then here's the sentencing guidelines? Because we heard that with second degree murder, you could get up to 40 years behind bars, but the sentencing guidelines suggest it could be more like 12 and a half years. That's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So sentencing guidelines, what you're talking about with what is kind of normal or past precedent in the area?
Yes, that's a perfect way to say it. It's like what has been the precedent? What have other judges rendered in like similar cases? Because we know that if he's sentenced, let's say that he's sentenced to 40 years, the judge sentences him to 40 years. His attorney can then file an appeal and say, look, this sentence it's unreasonable. Yes, you have up to 40 years, but I think in this case, the judge rendered a decision for his sentence that was unreasonable. And then he can actually petition the court to reduce the sentence. But this would be after he's sentenced.
What are you going to be watching for in the sentencing part? And how important do you think that is to this particular case?
I am going to be looking for the victim impact statements. I think that's really, really important. And I forgot to mention before when you asked me a question in regards to what I thought the prosecution did very well. I thought having the individuals who were present at the scene, the individuals who attempted to stop the situation, I thought that their testimony was key. And I think that and I hate to say it like this because they're not victims, but in a sense they are, because they were there and they witnessed they witnessed George Floyd die, right? And that's something that they will take with them for the rest of their lives. And so I think that they, in part, provided victim impact statements during the trial. But I think the victim impact statements are going to be key. I think the judge is really going to take that into consideration. And I think that the judge will also take the prosecution's suggestions into consideration as well. But I do also think that the judge is going to take into consideration the fact that he was a police officer, that the fact that, he was a civil, I guess, servant, you can call him, it was his duty to protect and serve. I think he'll take that, some mitigating factors into consideration as well.
I was looking at a report from CBS News that said that the prosecutors have already signaled that they will seek a harsher sentence known as upward departure. Do you know what that could mean? Could that mean that they could seek more than the 40 years that could be the potential for second degree murder. I've never heard that before. And
Me
again, it's
neither.
just one report from well, if it's a report, then maybe that's not as relevant. Yes, it was a report from CBS News, and that's why I flagged it, because I've never heard it. They said that in addition to that, just as you said, prosecutors were looking at presenting aggravating factors, that he was treated with particular cruelty. George Floyd was treated with particular cruelty, and that his death occurred in front of children. And that was going to be part of their sentencing argument.
Okay, so I see where they're coming from. So they're trying to enhance, we would call it an enhancing the sentence. I see what they're trying to say. If they are trying to do that, it could possibly stack on additional time to the sentence. And if they do that, I think that's something that it'd be something that's not done frequently. I'll say that. A lot of the time, sentencing enhancements happen when there's something like particularly egregious, which in this case, you can make that argument, especially because of the fact that it was done in front of children or a child, and that his conduct and his actions were considered to be totally unreasonable. I never thought that they would have done this, because the charges that they charged him with were not intentional. They didn't, you didn't have to show that he intended to commit these crimes. And so I would have never thought that they would have tried to attach some enhancements.
Well, let's see. I mean, it's interesting. That's why I flagged it, because I hadn't seen it before. We don't know if it's true. So it is from one source, which is CBS News, which is fairly reliable, but we'll see what actually happens over the next several weeks, because they have a little time to produce this report. I want to ask you as well as this about the symbolic nature of the sentencing, not just the what are the guidelines, but those are important to know what is even on the table here. I was listening to a really interesting interview with an African-American poet. His name is Kwame Alexander. And this is what he said that really struck me. He was talking about his reaction to the verdict. And he said, I think my reaction was a mix of sadness and glee. It's that this is a great first step, but it's a small step. The jury, they knew that the country would burn if they got this wrong. It's the feeling that this judge better not give him a cakewalk sentence either. How do you feel about the sentencing and what it means to this case overall? I know we kind of touched on that a few moments ago, but do you agree with that? Is the sentencing just as important as the verdict? Is there a symbolic message here that, in your opinion, is really important?
I do. That is such a great point. I think that this the judge's ultimate decision and how much he decides to sentence Derek Chauvin, I think, will be very important, because the jury came to their conclusion. They found him guilty. But if there's a sentence that's rendered, in which Judge Cahill delivers a sentence that's just kind of like let's say that he just gets 5 years for everything, right? Well, that couldn't happen, because I think the least amount is 10 years. So let's say that he gets just 10 years for everything, right? A lot of people would take that as, I guess, offensive, because somebody lost their life, right? And there have been individuals who have been sentenced for drug offenses for a lot more than that, right? And the fact that the whole world was a witness to George Floyd's death, and that an individual, or Derek Chauvin in this case, would potentially be released within 10 years, and probably earlier than that if you consider good time for credit served. If that were the case, I think that it would upset a great deal of people, and I think that people would think it's a mockery of the criminal legal system. That
because it's an understanding that's important, because as you move in the news cycle from story to story, there's this moment where it feels like the story closes, even though there's other developments to watch. And that's a really good signal to our audience about why we need to pay attention over the next several weeks, and why it may matter to some about what exactly the sentencing looks like and how symbolic that could be. One of the things that Mr. Alexander mentioned, and I just read it, was about the jury. And there's been a lot of questions about whether or not Derek Chauvin could receive a fair trial. And he meant, as I just read, the jury, they knew the country would burn if they got it wrong. The sentiment of what's at stake for the jury was something that just came out in an interview this morning of our chat. And maybe by the time our audience sees this interview, other jurors have spoken out, but we haven't seen any speak. We saw one alternate juror speak out. And one of the things that she described to a journalist is that as she was driving home from court one day, she had to drive through protests in the area that were for another police-involved shooting. And she was describing this as being part of her experience and just trying to paint a picture of what she was going through. But how strong do you think the argument is that Derek Chauvin didn't get a fair trial, that it's going to be very difficult for him to get a fair trial, and that there's prejudice in the jury simply because of the high-profile nature of this case and because of the protests and the riots that occurred in the months and weeks following the death of George Floyd?
Well, I think both sides during the voir dire, which is jury selection, I think both sides did a really, really good job with their questioning and with the questions that they asked the jurors. And I thought that the jurors, from what I read, I thought the jurors were very, very honest with their responses. You had some members of the jury who, believed in Black Lives Matter, but you also had some members of the jury who said, yes, I believe in Black Lives Matter, but I have law enforcement officers in my family, and I hold them to very, very high regard. I want to believe that members of the jury came to their decision because the prosecution proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. I would hope that they did not feel pressure from the events that happened over the summer or the events happening during the trial to render a decision. Because we have to think about it this way. Technically, members of the jury are supposed to be sequestered. They're not supposed to be, cognizant, or if they are cognizant of other events that are happening that could affect their decision, they're really not supposed to consider that at all, right? But the day and age that we live in, how is that even possible? So I think that that's a really, really hard question to answer because I want to believe in our criminal legal system, and I want to believe that it operated the way that it was supposed to. And there have been other cases where officers have been tried in the same jurisdiction in which there were protests, in the same jurisdiction where there was like a lot of uproar about what happened, but the decision wasn't the same. And so I want to believe that he did receive a fair and accurate trial. Yep.
The same juror said one, and you had mentioned it as well, one of the most important things for her, and again, she did not deliberate. She ended up being an alternate, so she did not deliberate, but she saw the full case. And she said the video was extremely impactful, but also the testimony of the young woman who was 17 at the time, who took that video. How important do you think that video was to the case? And how important do you think that video is in general for the broader conversation we're having about race and law enforcement in America?
Mm-hmm. So I think that video, if it wasn't for that video, I don't think we'd be here talking about this case today. Because there was a statement that was released, I guess, after the incident in which they just spoke about the incident as if it was like a medical situation, and not the fact that Derek Chauvin was on George Floyd's neck for an extended period of time, which is what led to him not being able to breathe. So I think that, you have to even think that this case was discussed during the confirmation hearing of the Supreme Court justice that was recently brought to the court, right?
Absolutely. Amy Coney Barrett. Exactly.
Yes. And I think that this video caused a lot of conversations, perhaps a lot of difficult conversations to happen, both in the home and in the workplace. I think it it forced people to have conversations that they probably wouldn't have had if it wasn't for this video. Mm-hmm.
What do you think it means for the other officers that are charged?
I think this verdict says a lot. I think it's funny. A legal analyst was saying it on the news or on one of the news stations the other day that if I'm one of the officer's attorneys, I'm calling the DA's office on Monday morning and asking for a cup of coffee to see what we can do to resolve this case. Because if they were able to come to that verdict with Derek Chauvin, who was I guess the main actor in this case, right? What you can only think that the same thing is going to happen to the other officers. And so I think that there's probably a lot of discussion that's happening now in attempts to try and resolve the matters. And if not, if they're going to trial, and I think the trials may be set in August.
It's in a few months from now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I don't know if the country wants to relive this whole thing all over again. And that's what's going to happen. And I mean, as we know, there was an incident that occurred during the trial. There was an incident that occurred recently with a girl named Ma'Khia Bryant. After the trial, this is something that just continuously happens. And now you're having members of the jury who are seeing this again and again and again. And I think that it's just going to be a really, really tough situation for these officers who have to go to trial in a few months.
And all those the incidents that you mentioned, there's been, as you rightly point out, there's been so many different incidents after George Floyd that have involved police officer shootings or otherwise that have been highly publicized. Each one is a little bit different. They're all not exactly the same. Yeah. And so one of the other questions that we're also asking is, what is the impact on policing? If we're looking for the safety and what's ideal for everyone in our communities, what do you think is the impact on policing overall? Are you concerned about that?
I think there's always been a concern in my mind about policing in America specifically. And I think this particular situation, although we've been seeing it for so long, but I think this particular situation, I want to hope is the straw that broke the camel's back. I think there have been, after George Floyd, after Breonna Taylor, there has been a concerted effort around the country to make changes in policy and legislation. We have Breonna's Law, we have the George Floyd Act, and that's just federally, right? And so we know that states around the country are changing laws on their own. And so I think that there will be a serious change in a lot of policing. I know that there's been the, I guess the call for defunding the police. I don't know if that's going to happen. I want to be perfectly honest, but there are ways to effectuate change with police by changing the laws. And one of them is LEBR, which is the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. And what that deals with is it's the law enforcement officer's rights when they are involved in some kind of misconduct, right? And so it's basically like an officer can't be questioned without his attorney present, but he has a certain period of time in which to obtain an attorney, like let's say 30 days. This is not something that a defendant would have, right? So if we have to change the laws in regards to police when they're involved in misconduct. We know it's far and few in between that officers are actually convicted of crimes that they may have committed, right? And so one of the legislations that I'm seeing is changing the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights to find that an officer could be fired for misconduct or his what's called his they have post certifications, his post certification being revoked because of misconduct, so that he can't then leave his job or be terminated by one job and then go to the next precinct, like down the street and get another job. Does that make sense? So we want to stop these bad actors we want to stop them, and we want to prevent them from being able to do this again and again and again.
The question about whether or not there's a legal solution or a legal improvement to policing, if you're operating from the assumption that policing needs to be improved, but not everybody is. I've spoken to some police over the last year who say, listen, a lot of my job is very litigious already. And we're doing the best that we can in very difficult situations. And one bad cop doesn't represent the rest of us. And the more that we get litigious, it's going to be harder for us to do our job, which is actually worse for the community overall. If you were sitting down with a police officer and having that conversation with him or her, what would you say? What would be your argument back about why you believe that there are solutions that could be legal that will help everybody in this situation?
Well, I have to think about it this way. If myself as an attorney, if I do something that's not in the best interest of my client, I'm going to get censured for that. I could potentially lose my license. I won't be able to practice anymore. I think that a lot of the times, different professionals are held more accountable for their actions, for their bad actions, and police officers generally aren't. And I do understand that not every police officer is out there to do a bad job. There are police officers who really want to be invested in their communities and do what they're out there to do, to protect and serve. But until I think that this is like a power construct, right? And I think that some officers want to show their power and over the community. And I don't think that being too litigious is the wrong way to go, because what other avenue are we going to take?
Well, that's a great question. And that's something that the president and the vice president talked about shortly after the verdict. What they were talking about is not only George Floyd, but about systemic racism and how that's an issue and what they wanted to do to combat it. And I find, Stephanie, that we use terms like systemic racism often, but then we don't ever define them. They become part of our conversation, but we don't stop to say, wait a minute, do our definitions match of that? How would you describe systemic racism?
Systemic racism is racism that has been perpetuated since this country was born. And there has been nothing, there have been attempts to fix it. There have been attempts to remedy it. But once an attempt is made to fix it, there's something else that comes up. So we have to, if we're keeping it 100, if we're being completely transparent, racism is embedded in our country. It's been here since, the first slaves were brought to this country such a long time ago. And there have been so many individuals who have attempted to combat systemic racism. But I think it's just so embedded in our society, and this is not just America, it's around the world. It's been so embedded in our society that there has to be a revolutionary change in order for it to end, because I guess it's something that this country is just so used to, and it's so used to seeing that even a lot of the times when a person may feel that they're being discriminated against racially, that somebody else may not even see it in that kind of way. Like, for example, I'll give you like a really easy example. I can't, like a long time ago, I wouldn't say that long ago, but it would be really difficult for me to wear my hair in a natural state, right? A lot of people, let's say, even if I was going on TV, right? A lot of people would think, well, what's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong with wearing your hair in a natural state? But for some people, it's not deemed professional, right? And to me, that's embedded in systemic racism, because I don't feel comfortable, or somebody else may not feel comfortable with me wearing my hair in a natural state because it's not what's generally seen, you know? And so let me say this. George Floyd's daughter made the perfect statement. She said, "My dad changed the world," right? And I think that as horrible as it is to say that something like this needed to happen in order to open more eyes, because I see this all the time. Other people may see this all the time, but I think this particular act was just so horrible that other people were able to realize we have a problem and we need to fix it.
Another term that's been used often is that America is at a point of reckoning.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you believe that.
I do, but we're at a point of reckoning, but what are we going to do?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And it's a really hard one that we're probably not going to answer in the next period of time that we have.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a question that's come up repeatedly in a lot of different stories over the last year. And I've noticed a trend, Stephanie. The idea of a point of reckoning, whether it's on any number of news stories,
mm-hmm.
and it's a question about where does the solution lie? And it comes back to a fundamental question about America. Does it lie with the federal government? Does it lie with the state government? Does it lie with the local community? Who actually has the power? And it's a question that America has tackled since the very beginning of our founding too, which brings us sort of full circle about whether or not there's a legislative solution, and where do you think that should come from? Where do you think that should come from? Where is the legislative solution, if it exists?
Mm-hmm.
Is it from, I don't want to say big government because that sounds biased, but it's the federal government. It's like big government, little government. I'm thinking about like the three bears, the big government, the medium government, or your real local government. Or does it not rely there at all? Because what we're talking about is deeper than that.
Okay, so I think that's such a great question. I think that it starts, because it's so deep, I think it starts with individual people, right? I think that we each have to, and it's everyone. We each have to open our eyes. We each have to understand that we don't know someone else's background. We don't know where they've come from. Like I can say that, I could look at you and think, oh my gosh, Jenna's just gorgeous. She has this wonderful background, and, her life must have been so easy. But I don't know your background, right? I don't know if, you worked your behind off to get to where you are, and you just, you overcame so many obstacles, but I wouldn't know that about you unless we have that conversation. And I think it's really, really important that we have conversations with one another. I think that's first. Second, our society was built on laws. If you think of the Code of Hammurabi, you think of the 10 Commandments, the United States Constitution. Laws will forever be here, and laws dictate how we live our lives. Laws were, put in place so that you and I couldn't vote for a period of time. Right? Laws
wasn't that long ago, by the way.
Wasn't that long ago, right?
100 years, right.
Mm-hmm. So changes in legislation, changes in our policies, they're so important. And it comes around to what you asked me, like, why do I do what I do? And what made me decide to do what I do? And it's because I strenuously and strongly believe that I can effectually change by doing my part, by going to the Capitol and saying that changes to this law needs to be made in order for poor and disenfranchised individuals, Black people, in order for them to be able to have a fair chance in this world.
It's such a valuable perspective on law and life, actually. I always ask people at the end of our interviews, how we can be a little bit smarter. And I feel with your last answer, we were getting an idea of where your heart is and how passionate you are about your practice. For people that aren't involved in the law, but do want to be smarter, for lack of a better term, about this conversation and thinking about how to be part of a solution, something that would help improve the community. And we may look at that in different ways.
Right.
What would you say? What would be your reflection over the last year as a lawyer, as a mom, and as an American?
Sure. I think conversations are key. I think communication is so important. I think that, and that's what I alluded to before. If we can't speak to one another, if we can't have compassion, if we can't just have a basic understanding of where someone has been and how they got to where they are or why they are in the position that they're in, I don't think that we can move forward. I think that being able to just sit down and have a conversation, even if it's with somebody whose views do not align with yours, you may find that you have something else in common with them. And I think that that's just so important. I'm not saying kumbaya, that, just conversations are going to fix everything. They're not. But I think it's a step. It's definitely a step in the right direction.
That's really, again, very valuable for us, Stephanie, and something I'm really proud of the Smarter News audience. I know social media, which is one way that people consume our content, there can be, colorful commentary, I'm going to say. And that's okay. Sometimes people need to do, and you know what? It's the freedom of expression is important within reason for us. And we, of course, allow conversation to happen. But what I love about our community is that you have really, really different people, and they all hang out together at Smart News. And it's like, this is amazing. And so we hope to be part of that solution, but also we hope that this conversation, highlights different vibrations of the broader conversation that we're having overall in America. This has been really helpful. Stephanie, I hope you'll come back. We didn't even get to the federal investigation that's taking place. That's a whole other story. So once we get through the sentencing, look at the federal investigation into Derek Chauvin, as well as the Minneapolis Police Department. That might give us some more opportunity to chat. But I really appreciate the time today. And thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on, Jenna. I look forward to the next time.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.